Well, sorry for that. I thought we were heading into a break, which must have been on a very old agenda. I thought the last session was really inspiring, and and particularly I think Tim's answer to the question about being a farmer was, I think, quite interesting. When I was doing my internship in South Africa, my wife booked me in for a 2-week farmers extension course in what was then Zululand to do some sustainable farming practices with local farmers, which I did. And I probably actually learned more from that than what I'd learned in my internship. But it certainly carried over the potential for looking at where the food comes from. And curiously then, and this was the late 70s, the whole farming practices were entirely based on ecological principles, and that's why we went to take a look at it. I mention that because we do so easily forget that we've drifted away from what was seen as normal practice way back into what has become a world in which the environmental damage is rising fast and the health damages are starting to rise as well. I want to just add one more comment before we get on to George as well. I particularly am thrilled about this meeting because it's really addressing a failure I always felt in my career. When I was at WHO, David Nabarro and I both had parts of the agenda for nutrition. He had undernutrition and I had overnutrition. And we went down to the Food and Agriculture Organization in about 1998, 1999, and tried to get our colleagues there to work with us to develop some scenarios of what should the food supply look like 20, 30 years from then if it met the optimal nutrition needs of all. And by all, we meant addressing the overconsumption side of obesity and the undernutrition side. There was enthusiasm in the scenario development group, but the heads of nutrition at the time did not enjoy this idea at all, for many reasons. I think first they saw that it would threaten many people on the agricultural commodity side because it would highlight what is being produced in excess. And our argument was that doing it over a 30-year time span would give you plenty of transition time to actually reduce the resistance and see the opportunities on the gap side, particularly in the area of diverse foods, the fruits and vegetables, produce, nuts, grains, and many of the other issues. We've heard elements of this starting to be met in this meeting, and I hope that we could still keep this bigger need in mind, and it has to be done globally. It can't be done by any country. I get terribly fearful when I hear that Sweden is planning to develop its own self-sufficiency food program. That would be a disaster for the planet. It would be the height of selfishness for one very simple reason. Sweden is blessed with some of the best water resources now and for the next 50 years. Their responsibility is not just to become self-sufficient, but become a net exporter of food that is going to be required around the world as the water crisis gets worse, as is the case for much of Northern Europe. A Northern European perspective on food self-sufficiency would be a disaster and would mean hunger and famine in much of Africa and much of the water-constrained parts of the world. I mention that because we haven't focused on the need to be thinking globally about the sourcing of food. And while it's very nice to think about some local ideas and initiatives, that's not going to solve the long-term needs, the dreadfully pressing needs of water-constrained parts of the world that we haven't spoken about enough, that are simply getting worse and worse and worse. And for them, thinking about local self-sufficiency basically means mass famine and death. Not a very exciting way to start this session. I also just wanted to comment on one other point, and that was that I do think as we move ahead, we've got to think about there being a broader coalition of the willing than is often seen in front of us. I mentioned that similar debates to this have been happening within the World Economic Forum's sustainable agriculture groups for some time, and linking to food security. They're leading corporations, and I think particularly those who may not be directly linked to a particular product or maybe the ones to talk to and to engage. So the broad investor community is very interested, whether it's UBS or Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, or BlackRock. Many of the informed long-term investor analysts are taking this issue very seriously. The reinsurance world, Swiss Re, Hanover, for example, are very interested because of the long-term serious risks of both climate change and mass famine and hunger, and what this means, coupled with some of the growing concerns about obesity. The insurance world and the retail world, who sit at the pivot between the food manufacturers and the consumers. And while we could go into that later, I hope that we would find a way to reach out with the report that would come out of it, or the summary of this meeting, because I think we would find a lot more synergy than we suspect. But that's the lofty world of high-level policy thought and discourse. We now really have a privilege to have George Lowenstein join us to really bring this home at one of the most important points in the debate, and that is the reality that none of the changes happen unless individuals at the point of purchase make a decision that can, in fact, have a big impact on their lives and their health and on the environment. And how do we coax people into being able to make that decision in a way in which it does support sustainable diets? Because if they do that, and we align the policy world, I think we'll end up being able to get onto the track that we're all hoping for. So, George, wonderful to have you join us.